They don't notice it at first, because nothing explodes, nothing ends, nothing dramatic happens. The messages still come, the bond still exists, but something fundamental has stopped working, and they can feel it, just not clearly enough to explain, because the shift didn't happen in them. It happened in you. And once it happens, the entire dynamic loses its grip, not through confrontation, not through distance, but through internal withdrawal from a role you didn't know you were playing. That's the moment. Everything changes, not externally, structurally, because this dynamic was never built on behavior alone. It was built on regulation, on how much emotional weight you carried for both people, on how much you softened, adjusted, held, anticipated. Once that stops, the system collapses quietly. And that's what this video is about. The dynamic only worked because you were participating in ways you never consented to. You were filling gaps, absorbing uncertainty, stabilizing the emotional field. Not consciously, but consistently. You were the one who noticed the shift in tone, the one who bridged silence, the one who named connection. Without demanding it, you became the buffer between closeness and their discomfort with it. And here's the part most people miss. They didn't ask you to do this, but their nervous system relied on it. Because every time intimacy rose, you softened the landing. Every time distance appeared, you compensated with patience. Every time clarity was needed, you waited instead. This wasn't weakness. It was attunement. But attunement without reciprocity turns into self-abandonment. And eventually, something in you noticed. Not cognitively, somatically. Your body stopped leaning in. Your energy stopped reaching. Your system stopped trying to regulate the space between you. That's the shift. And when it happens, the dynamic loses its fuel. Because now, there's no one smoothing the edges, no one translating silence, no one maintaining emotional continuity. When the other person pulls back, and without that invisible labor, the relationship feels different, heavier, awkward, disconnected. Not because you changed the rules, but because you stopped compensating for imbalance. This is why they feel it. Before they understand it, they may say, something feels off. You're different. I don't feel the same closeness. But they can't name why. Because from their perspective, you haven't done anything. You're still kind, still present, still respectful. You just aren't carrying what was never yours. And that's unsettling. Because the dynamic no longer regulates them. It reflects them. Their pauses feel longer. Their distance feels colder. Their inconsistency feels exposed. Not because you point it out, but because you no longer cover it. This is where the dynamic stops working. Not because of boundaries, but because of neutrality. You're no longer chasing connection. You're not withdrawing either. You're simply not compensating. And that creates a mirror they didn't expect. One where they feel the weight of their own patterns. For some, this creates awareness. For others, discomfort. But for all, it changes the equation. Because the relationship can no longer run on asymmetry. It requires presence from both sides, or it stagnates. This is why avoidant dynamics often unravel after this shift. Not in chaos, but in stillness. Because stillness doesn't hide anything. Without emotional labor to keep things moving, the relationship reveals what it actually is and what it can't be. You may notice they reach out differently, not more deeply, but more vaguely, testing access, checking availability, seeing if the old rhythm returns. And when it doesn't, confusion sets in because the rules changed without a conversation. But in truth, the rules didn't change. The illusion did. You stopped playing a role. That made imbalance feel normal. And once you do that, you can't unsee it. You feel more grounded, less anxious, more present with yourself, even if the relationship feels uncertain, because your system is no longer in overdrive. This is the paradox. The dynamic stops working, but you start stabilizing. And that's not coincidence. That's regulation returning to where it belongs, in you. This shift feels threatening, not because you pulled away, but because the dynamic was never neutral. It relied on movement, on you leaning in when they leaned out, on you translating silence into safety, on you holding emotional continuity, even when connection thinned. When that stops, the dynamic loses balance. An imbalance always reveals truth, because dynamics aren't powered by intention, they're powered by participation. And once participation changes, the system reacts, not emotionally, reflexively. You might notice a subtle tension appear. Conversations feel flatter. Pauses feel longer. There's less flow, not because love disappeared, but because regulation did. This is where many people panic. They think, I broke something. I should fix this. I need to explain. But explanation won't restore what explanation never created. The dynamic didn't work because of communication. It worked because of compensation. And compensation is unsustainable. Here's what's important to understand. When you stop regulating someone else's comfort, you don't create distance. You reveal it. You reveal how much space was already there. You reveal how much effort was being quietly supplied by one side. This is why the shift feels heavy, not dramatic. Heavy, because now the relationship has to stand on its own structure. And if that structure was built on asymmetry, it starts to wobble. This wobble can look like confusion. They might reach out more, but not deeper. They might initiate contact, but without vulnerability. They might say they miss you, but avoid presence. Because what they miss isn't intimacy, it's regulation, the ease, the smoothing, the emotional continuity. They didn't have to provide. And when it's gone, they feel unsteady, but they don't interpret it as their own discomfort. They interpret it as something changing in you. You're different. You don't feel the same. You're distant. These statements aren't accusations. They're observations from a system that lost external regulation. And here's the critical point. If you rush to reassure, you re-enter the role. If you over-explain, you stabilize the imbalance. If you chase clarity, you restore the old dynamic. But if you stay present, without compensating, something else happens. The system reorganizes, either toward mutuality or toward disengagement. But either way, it becomes honest. This is where fear arises. Not fear of losing the relationship, fear of seeing it clearly. Because clarity removes fantasy. It removes potential. It removes the story that if I just try harder, this will deepen. When you stop trying harder, the truth surfaces. And truth is uncomfortable. For dynamics built on ambiguity. Ambiguity allows projection, hope, endurance. But clarity demands capacity. Can this person meet me here? Can they hold presence without me carrying the weight? Can intimacy exist without me translating it? If the answer is yes, the dynamic transforms. If the answer is no, the dynamic dissolves. Not explosively, but quietly. And here's where identity begins to shift. You stop asking how to fix it. You start asking how it feels in your body. You notice you're calmer, less vigilant, less anticipatory, even when the relationship feels uncertain. Because uncertainty is less dysregulating than self-abandonment. This is a major nervous system recalibration. You are no longer orienting around someone else's capacity. You're orienting around your own alignment. And that's why the dynamic can't return to what it was. Because you can't unknow what you're no longer willing to carry. You're not withholding. You're not punishing. You're not withdrawing love. You're simply no longer over-functioning emotionally. And that creates a new baseline, one where connection must be mutual, or it can't sustain itself. This is not empowerment through force. It's empowerment through refusal to self-erase. And that refusal changes everything. After the shift, something unexpected happens. Your attention comes back to you, not in a dramatic way, in a quiet one. You stop monitoring the dynamic. You stop checking energy. You stop interpreting silence. Not because you don't care, but because your system no longer feels responsible. This is where many people think they're becoming detached. But it's not detachment, it's recentering. Detachment is numb. This is regulated. You still feel. You just don't overextend. And that difference is crucial. Because now, your emotional availability has a direction. It flows both ways. Or it stays with you. This is the point where the dynamic truly shifts. Not because the relationship changed, but because your internal orientation did. Before, you were oriented toward maintenance. Now, you're oriented toward truth. Truth in how something feels. Truth in how something moves. Truth in what's actually being met. And this truth doesn't need force. It doesn't need confrontation. It just needs presence. You start noticing patterns you used to override. How often conversations stayed surface level. How vulnerability wasn't mirrored. How depth had a ceiling. Not as criticism, as observation. And observation without urgency is powerful. Because urgency keeps you entangled. Observation creates choice. This is when identity calm begins to solidify. You don't need to be chosen urgently. You don't need to be proven right. You don't need the other person to suddenly change. You're no longer waiting. Not in resignation. In groundedness. Waiting dissolves. When you're aligned, you're available, but not leaning. Open, but not overreaching. And this state changes how you experience connection. The relationship may continue, but it feels different, slower, less consuming. Or it may fade, without collapse, without emotional whiplash, because the bond was no longer tied to self-regulation. Here's what's important. This shift doesn't make you cold. It makes you congruent. Your inner experience matches your outer behavior. You're no longer saying, "I'm fine," when your body is tense. You're no longer calling patience what was actually endurance. You're no longer confusing hope with compatibility. And this clarity creates emotional safety, not with the other person, with yourself. This is the stage where people often fear loss because identity is reorganizing. You're not who you were in the dynamic, but you're not yet anchored in the next version. There's a liminal space here, and it can feel empty. But emptiness is not absence. It's space. Space for a different kind of connection. One that doesn't rely on asymmetry. One that doesn't require translation. One that doesn't demand you go smaller to stay close. This is where your system learns. A new baseline. Calm without distance. Connection without self-erasure. Availability without pursuit. And once your system learns this, it won't go back. Not because you're rigid, but because your body recognizes what's sustainable. This is why the dynamic can't reform, even if the other person tries, even if they return with interest, even if they lean in temporarily. Because now, you feel the difference. You sense when effort is one-sided. You notice when depth is avoided. And instead of reacting, you stay present. And presence without compensation is a filter. It doesn't punish. It clarifies. What can meet you remains. What can't fades. Without force. Without drama. Without you needing to decide. This is the real ending of the dynamic. Not through rejection, but through alignment. And alignment is quiet, but it's irreversible. What settles in now is not certainty. It's steadiness. You're no longer trying to resolve the relationship. You're letting it reveal itself. And that's a different posture entirely. Because resolution seeks an answer. Revelation accepts reality. This is where your energy changes. Not outwardly. Internally. You don't brace. You don't hope. You don't dread. You stay present. And presence does something powerful. It removes pressure from you, from them, from the dynamic itself. There's no longer a role you're trying to perform. No part you're holding together. No rhythm you're maintaining alone. You show up as you are. If connection flows, it's mutual. If it doesn't, it's informative. And this neutrality is what finally ends the pattern. Not because you shut down, but because you stopped organizing your life around an imbalance. You're no longer measuring closeness by how much you adapt. You're measuring alignment, by how safe you feel being yourself. This creates a quiet confidence, not the performative kind, the embodied kind. You trust your responses. You trust your pacing. You trust your needs, without needing to justify them. And that trust reorients everything, because now you don't attach to potential. You attach to presence. You don't invest in possibility. You invest in reciprocity. And this doesn't make love smaller. It makes it cleaner, less exhausting, less confusing, more sustainable. If the other person can meet you here, the bond deepens naturally, without force, without strategy, without fear. If they can't, the distance speaks for itself. You don't need to interpret it. You don't need to explain it. You don't need to chase clarity. Clarity is already present. And this is the part that most people don't expect. You don't feel triumphant. You feel calm. You don't feel empowered. You feel settled. Because true shifts don't announce themselves. They stabilize you. They quiet the noise. They bring you home, to your own nervous system. This is what it means to stop participating in the dynamic, not through withdrawal, but through integration. You're still open, still capable of intimacy, still willing to connect, but you're no longer available for patterns that require self-erasure. And once this line is crossed, it doesn't move back, not because you're rigid, but because your body knows better now. If this resonated, it's because you're already on this side of the shift. And if you felt seen, not activated, not destabilized, but steady, leave a comment, not as agreement, as recognition, because this isn't an ending. It's the point where you stop repeating the same beginning.